Hand-drawn animation has always fascinated me. I have so much respect for artists who can consistently draw from one frame to the next and make amazing looking animations without any keyframes, any digital keyframes. So I had a quick conversation with one of my favorite animators, Reece Parker, who does a lot of work for Battle Axe. Just amazing artist, not just in Cel Animation, but designer, director. He's just a man of many, many talents. And you should go check out his work if you're not familiar with him, and check out his Instagram where he does real reviews all the time. He's just such a great guy. But I just wanted to share this conversation where I discuss his Cel Animation process, the different softwares he's using, how he's grown as an artist over the years, and the advice that he would give to anyone who wants to try their hand at frame-by-frame animation. So enjoy this conversation with Reece Parker. So are you a Cel animator? Is that the right term, Cel Animation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different names. Cel Animation is the easiest to recall, but I think purists would not agree that we're even doing anything similar to what would be original celluloid animating frame by frame.
Okay.
Which leads to the next term, which is frame by frame. You can see it just takes longer to say, or hand-drawn animation.
Yeah.
But the distinguishing factor is like important, because what's traditional is maybe After Effects animators in our industry specifically, and it's very different. I mean, timings are like the only thing that really parallel or carry over from one workflow to the other. Okay. Otherwise, it's a completely different world, really.
Right. What kind of tools were you using when you first got into frame by frame?
You know, to be honest, I started animating at all really young on sticky notes.
Yeah.
So that technique was really familiar to me. Mm-hmm. And what was unique and interesting and different was After Effects and interpolating keyframes and math and things like that. Yeah. That was more like harder for me to grasp. When it sort of came full circle and I started to reinvest into frame by frame, Animate, I think, was the first thing I jumped back into, because it's sort of like, they do that. They have a good timeline for it. If you're not going to be like really in the weeds of drawing, it works really well for it. So I think it was there I jumped in first, and then eventually I migrated to Photoshop, weirdly, which again, that's not an animation app, but it's such a good drawing app. And there are tools, plugins to bring it to Photoshop that sort of make it a bit easier to actually animate in there. So yeah.
Cool. Did you ever do any kind of stop motion animation? Because that's where I first started with animation.
I did. Claymation.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, sir. It's really easy to iterate, and yeah, you see how small changes can have a big impact. And,
right.
You know, you sort of learn it that way.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to get into it. What about Procreate Dreams, the new Cel Animation software for the iPad? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so the release of Dreams, actually, they commissioned me to make a film entirely in Dreams. So that was a whole thing. And I was learning like a beta version, and I spent like a month, day and night in that thing, like working around sort of the stuff that wasn't finished, but also learning all of the cool stuff about it and how it works. And I really like it. Now I'm looking forward to its future state, where maybe it's a little more feature rich.
Sure.
But in its current state, it feels like I'm very much a desk guy, right? I've got multiple desks in different areas, and I like to kind of sit and work. It feels like I don't necessarily need that all the time now, and I'd be confident that I could still perform in client work, let's say if I was traveling or on the road. And before, I wouldn't have said that. But with Dreams and Procreate, it really feels that way now, which is crazy. I mean, an iPad, you know, I don't know, ask me 5 years ago, I would never have predicted I'll be able to do all my professional work on just an iPad and won't need my desktop stuff and blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty cool.
That's really exciting. I'm glad to see that Procreate is paying attention to animators and giving us a dedicated app specifically for animation. But what about Adobe Animate, which was originally Flash? How much time are you spending there?
Animate is where I started. I don't use it anymore, really. And that's because as I honed on my skills in frame by frame, I found that it was more limiting than it was empowering in terms of the fidelity of my animation.
Okay.
So I was finding more gaps between frames when I was searching for nuance and really small movements that its drawing renderer was like incapable of,
Okay.
right? So eventually I migrated out of Animate entirely, but I found it a good place to start because the timeline is so intuitive and easy to use. And you can draw, and you can also do vector shapes. So it's
Right.
sort of bridge. It's a nice bridge. In terms of like a larger workflow, it's really, really style dependent and project dependent, and it adapts. So there might be a job that's like very vectory, but super character heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And I go like, okay, Photoshop's going to be the hardest thing here because getting a real vector look in Photoshop is tedious and hard and annoying. Okay, so maybe I would rough it in Photoshop because I can get that movement that I'm like really attached to. Then I might take that into Animate for cleanups
Okay.
because you can manipulate shapes a bit easier there and vector is more natural there. Or I might skip Animate entirely and just take it to After Effects and like do kind of a hold frame by frame
Right.
thing in After Effects. It's like intuited at this point. It's so natural for me to jump around these softwares that when I see the shot, I know the movement, I go like, here's the fastest way. I already know it. And it kind of like evolves that way.
Yeah.
If it's a full frame by frame shot, I'm probably just doing it in Photoshop. Because again, I can draw, I can get all my textures in there, even some light compositing I can do in there before having to take everything to After Effects. So
You've really come a long way since making flipbook animations. It sounds
yeah,
like you're able to really learn new software whenever you need to and get a
yes.
real understanding of when you should be using one over the other.
And I think to that point, not to go on too long, it really is intimidating, and it was for me when I first started. New tools, different softwares. You're learning different sets of things, and even within those tools, you might have the pencil tool. They're going to react differently and do different things,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like I used to have this tendency to want to keep everything in After Effects, and I was scared to get out of it
Yeah.
because it's like you have to learn it, and then I had like there's anxiety, like, but when does this serve me best? When does this serve me best? And I like really Experience is the best teacher in this area because eventually it became well lubricated and very seamless for every project and specific. But it takes time and effort and like exploration, right?
Yeah. I think it's
Yeah.
almost kind of like learning, at least from what I've been told, learning another language. I feel like every time you learn another one, in the next one, you start to pick up on things quicker. And it was the
Yeah.
same way with software. Like I was the same way. I until even like as early as like 2016, I was like, I just
Yeah.
want to stay in After Effects. I don't
Yeah.
want to bounce around. I'm gonna make After Effects do everything that I can.
Yeah. Force it into everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It just
Yeah.
wasn't a great way to learn and to be able to work more efficiently. So it's good to expand out, but you're totally right. It's very intimidating. So let's talk about like your actual specific process for one of these projects. Say something that you were going to do entirely in Photoshop. There's different
Okay.
phases, right? Because you're not just sitting down and animating the final quality piece. So what does
Yeah.
that process look like for you?
Yeah. Correct. So it would start with either a script or like a rough idea in your head if it's a personal project versus a client project. From there, I'd either work on like an art directed sort of keyframe, meaning like I'm pitching this to the client how it might look.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the version, maybe a couple different versions. Or if they're more comfortable with who you are and they don't necessarily want that, then you could just go straight to rough boards, which is like mapping sketches to the script, right? Taking sort of the words and making them visual and like how would it move? And here's maybe some in-betweens and whatever. Try to sort of visualize it for the client.
Mm-hmm.
Great, let's say that's locked. Okay, then you'd probably move into a style frame, get that locked. Okay, then you would illustrate most of or all of the frames, maybe not really intricate in-betweener frames, but most of the key like scenes you would
Mm-hmm.
illustrate,
Mm-hmm.
get that locked, and then move into what I call roughs or rough animation or first pass. That's the stuff you see where there's different colored lines and
Right.
like things are really sort of ugly, but you're getting the movement. Like, let's say I'm having a character like reach and grab a coffee and drink it. I'd probably have like 4 frames to start. One where it's here. The next frame would be hand on coffee. Next would be hand to mouth. And next would be drinking. And these frames establish my action. And then what I do is I go and in between those frames, and I could even take several passes at that, meaning I would do like a blockier version of in between. So dot, dot, dot. And then I could revisit again and smooth that out should I feel like I need to, depending on the style.
Yeah.
So that's roughs.
Okay.
Then once you're feeling the roughs are good and approved or you're comfortable with them, it's moving into cleanup, which is the most tedious. Cleanup is essentially the stage in which you take the rough animation and you bring it up to the level of the approved style frames, right? So it's like an art directed level. There's a fidelity in terms of style, color, texture, and shapes. What can happen a lot and what I see a lot, especially in this industry with more junior cel animators, is they'll completely lose the shape of their characters, of their faces, of their even simpler shapes. They'll just lose it because you're drawing it every frame. So for example, let's say one of the frames had like a close to perfect circle, and that was the style frame. And you go like, great, I have all this cool movement, and you kind of get ahead of yourself. And that perfect circle starts to become like a milk splatter, and it's, there are little like signals of like less experienced cel animators that sort of come to life when they get more excited than maybe their skill level is able to accomplish. And that's another like one of the million things that makes cleanup really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And mostly it's just tedious. It's frame by frame by frame. Now you can save some time. Let's say I did all the color in Photoshop. So it's like, back to the coffee example, it's the torso, it's the head, it's the face, it's the hand. I got all the colors blocked and it's feeling right. It's layered out. I could send those layers to After Effects and then do a texture pass there. Let's say if there was texture on the artwork as well. And that could save me some time, likely, rather than drawing with brushes. There's ways to sort of interpret brushes in After Effects with effects and kind of make it look right. And do like more intuitive masking and things like that that make that process easier. And then final effects in After Effects, right? Maybe there's some grains or some blurs or some other cool things. Then ship it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my suspicions were correct then. It is just a lot of tedious work, and
yes,
I mean it's a craft. It's a skill I definitely don't have. I've never attempted to build up the skill of drawing, but I just watching people illustrate single pieces of art, I'm just like, yeah, I wish I could do that. I've never dedicated the time to try and practice that, but then repeating that in a consistent way from one frame to the next just seems like a really hard discipline to get good at.
The foundation truly is in drawing skill.
Right.
So for me, for example, I grew up drawing with a pencil like more than I was writing. I mean, it was like very second nature. So that helped it become more natural. But the simplest version is like, yeah, I'm taking one drawing and I'm expanding it out 1,000 times. And that's cel animation. Now, it's not necessarily that simple. There are ways to add efficiencies and make it feel more fluid and more natural than just like, here's 899th drawing, like like drained and drenched and like needing water.
Right.
It's not necessarily that bad, but sometimes I say that to the clients though, like, this is why it's so expensive. It's literally taking this and going 1,000 times. So that's why it's worth this much or whatever.
Yeah.
So
and I guess that's like why originally, like in traditional studios with cel animation, there were the keyframe artists, right? That were doing the key art and the key frames, and then there were in-betweeners who literally came in and tried to match the line work. And it's just the lines, right? I feel like I've watched this documentary on Disney stuff, but it's like that the key artist, then the in-betweeners who match those keyframes, line art styles, And then there were colorists who came in and literally painted the color, the fills in for every single frame on the backside, you know. So yeah, like it took hundreds of people to make any of those animations.
It's interesting too, like the famous old school Disney animators were typically the ones that did the keys, right? They would put the keys, which were the biggest, loudest, most expressive points of motion, and then they'd have, like, I don't want to be reductive, like the interns or the people that they were mentoring come in,
right,
and be the in-betweens, and they would give them notes like, this in-between was too boring. Let's say there's a ball here and here, and the intern did one smear frame. Like, very simple. They'd go like, no, what if it went down? What if it had an arch? What if it, whatever?
Yeah.
Which is a super interesting process. Yeah. I've never worked that way, but I've never had to. I mean, much easier. Yeah.
Totally. So I know you were involved with the beta of Timelord as well. What was it like going from working in Photoshop frame by frame without and with Timelord? What is Timelord doing for you in Photoshop that helps the process go a little faster?
A lot of different things. Something that's super annoying, going back to jumping between softwares, even Adobe Suite software. Sorry, Adobe. They don't play very well together. They're very much their own islands.
Yeah.
Even today at 2024, but this was back in 2017 or something. So it was more true then. Like getting a file out of a thing is a whole thing. And then bringing that file back into After Effects is a whole process. And it's like layering and organizing and it's just like tedious. Timelord just bridged the gap like immediately. So you just press a button, you send it to After Effects, and it feels like they're really playing together better. They're talking to each other better. Mm-hmm. You can also send things back from After Effects into Photoshop. Let's say you timed it slightly incorrectly. You could get that reference nailed down and send it back. Continue in Photoshop and send it back. Yeah. Make live edits in some cases, and it would reflect in After Effects if you're working with the Photoshop file itself. There's interesting things that you could do. And then they have like a timeline feature in Timelord as well. So there's add frame, delete frame, hold frame, and all these sort of timeline features that if you didn't have a different timeline plugin before, it would be like world changing.
Yeah.
Because it makes it like an animation app, which Photoshop certainly is not an animation app. So hugely helpful. I mean, it's a bit more of a niche tool for those that choose to stick in Adobe. I do because most of my projects end up in After Effects.
Right.
So I like to stick in Adobe rather than, venturing out into the TV paints and the harmonies. And that's just my preference. So very helpful. Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been awesome, Reece. I love getting to see this insight into your workflow and what this world of cel animation frame by frame looks like. Is there anything that you would tell viewers who maybe want to try to get into cel animation for themselves? Any advice you would give them?
I would say draw more often than maybe you would usually draw. It needs to become more of like a natural skill for you. And even when not animating, it's just going to help. I mean, it's a really, really foundational kind of building skill set that will transition directly into your ability to frame by frame. Don't get too hung up on your AE skill set and your ability to kind of interpolate and manipulate the graph editor. Again, your timing sensibility will transition. Nothing else will. It's going to be a different world for you. And then get the Animator's Survival Kit by Richard Williams.
Yes.
That's the only thing that really, really, really was like, oh, this is how it works for me.
Right.
It was, just read that book and you go like, okay, this is starting to make a lot more sense.
Well, Reece, thank you so much again for coming on the channel. It's been great talking to you, and I can't wait to see what you make next.
Appreciate it, Jake. Yep, thanks for having me.